With this letter, the Somali community in Minnesota is acknowledging that, by their own words, they don't have that level of moral awareness, which means quite simply that they don't have any business being in this country. They should be deported, and their temporary protected status, which has gone on for 34 years, should be immediately rescinded. More than any other failed state in Africa, Somalia has been in the news a lot lately. First, several Somalis were convicted in a $250 million scheme to defraud U.S. taxpayers by claiming they cooked meals for children when they were really buying sports cars. Then several Somali politicians in the U.S., including Ilhan Omar, announced that they're working on behalf of Somali interests, not America's. Then a Somali man in a playground in Minnesota harassed a woman named Shiloh Hendricks and her 18-month-old child, prompting the woman to drop the N-bomb, heard around the world. Then to cap it all off, the Democrat Party endorsed a Somali socialist to be the next mayor of Minneapolis. And at the moment, he appears to be probably the front runner. So it's safe to say that 3 decades after the U.S. government determined that Somalis deserve temporary protected status in this country as refugees from their own dysfunctional governance, a temporary status that has never been revoked, Somalis are dominating our news cycle and some of our major elections as well. And yet, for all the ways that Somalis have found their way into our national discourse in recent months, there's one fundamental question that has remained unanswered. What exactly are all these Somalis doing in the country? What value do they add? What's their goal? We're told that if we draw any general conclusions about Somalis, Somali culture, based on the observable behavior of Somalis, then we're bigots. We're not allowed to inquire into their motives in any way. But despite all the deflection, no one has ever explained in any affirmative way what Somalis actually care about. What's their culture all about? This culture that we're importing into this country en masse. What core principle would they defend in large numbers if it ever came under attack? We know, based on the candidates they elect, that Somalis wouldn't defend the Constitution or the freedom of speech or freedom of association. So what's their motivation? Aside from draining the U.S. Treasury, what single issue really matters to them? Regardless of how often I've asked this question, directly or indirectly, I've never received a response, but suddenly, and somewhat unexpectedly, that's all changed now, thanks to a court case in Minnesota involving a Somali man named Khalil Ibrahim Diri. Now the mystery is over. Yes, as part of this criminal proceeding, the Somali community in the state of Minnesota has just revealed what they're truly passionate about. And their answer, in rather unambiguous terms, is that they're passionate, apparently, about the right of men to sexually abuse and torment other people's children. This is the culture they're defending. This is what they're willing to excuse, and there's no debating this. They went to court and made their voices very clear. Now, let's start with the specifics of this case. Local news in Minnesota won't really talk about it for obvious reasons, so instead of playing a clip, I'll summarize the background myself. 42-year-old Khalil was born in Somalia, spent several years in refugee camps in Kenya. He arrived in the United States in 2006. He worked as a driver for Uber and Lyft most of the time. In 2024, Khalil was in Minneapolis when he noticed that a 12-year-old girl was playing in her backyard alone. So he parked his Toyota in an alley outside and asked if the girl's mother was at home. She said no. Short time later, the man put his hand over the girl's mouth, hit her head to the point that she became dizzy and disoriented, drove her a short distance away, and sexually assaulted her in a manner that is too graphic to describe on this show. Now, 5 days later, the child told a school counselor about the attack. The next month, as police investigated, the girl's parents discovered that the man was still calling their daughter and sending her text messages. He was saying things like, quote, "Hey, beautiful, I miss you. When can I see you again?" The parents pretended to be their daughters to lure the man back. And when he arrived at the home, they held him there until police arrived. Once arrested, the man didn't display any form of contrition. He claimed that he thought the girl was 19 years old, which apparently would make it okay to abduct her. He criticized the mother. He continued to fight the charges until he was convicted of first-degree criminal sexual misconduct in May of this year. Now, based on this series of events, which again is as sanitized as I can make it for the purposes of this show, but based on all this, any community or culture with decency or morality would make it very clear that Khalil does not represent them. They wouldn't make excuses for him. They certainly wouldn't minimize what he had done. Instead, they would recognize his behavior as unspeakably evil, and if they said anything to him at all, they'd urge him to repent for the acts of horror that he committed, rather than, continue to dodge accountability as he's been doing. But that is not how the Somali community in Minneapolis has responded to this case. Instead, as Alpha News first reported, the Al Hissan Islamic Center in St. Paul submitted a community letter of support for this man addressed to the judge in the case. Now, I'm going to read directly from this letter because it answers any and all questions you might have about Somali culture and the Somali community in the United States. So this is them speaking for themselves. Here's what they wrote. Quote, "We, the undersigned members of the Somali community, write this letter to express our strong and heartfelt support for Kalinal Deary, a member of our community. Many of us first met Kalinal through our shared journey as Somali refugees, arriving in this country with little more than hope and determination to rebuild our lives. Like so many of us, Kalinal has faced the challenge of starting over in a new culture, learning English, adjusting to a fast-paced system, and raising children in an environment far different from the one he grew up in. Before the situation, Kalinal was known as a devoted family man and an outgoing person. Despite the financial pressures of life in the U.S., Kalinal also still managed to support needy family members back in Somalia. The situation Kalinal is currently facing comes as a deep shock to all of us." Now, this is a letter that you might write if this guy had, say, lost his license because he got too many speeding tickets or something, or if he got picked up by the IRS because he didn't file his taxes on time. It is not, to any sane person, an appropriate letter to write when Kalinal was just convicted for hitting a 12-year-old girl in the head, abducting her, sexually assaulting her, and then texting her to see when he could do it again. In no universe should an unrepentant rapist receive the strong and heartfelt support of anyone, much less an entire community of people, much less a community of people that we have invited into our home, into our country. Nor should this community of people repeatedly refer to this brutal sexual assault as a situation, which is probably the single most dismissive word they could have chosen. And on top of that, they shouldn't brag that he's funneling money out of the U.S. economy and sending it back to Somalia. But the most revealing part of the letter is when Somalis that wrote this letter explained that Kalinal, quote, has faced the challenge of starting over in a new culture. Well, that's about as explicit as it gets. Apparently, in Somali culture, at least according to the people who wrote this letter, this is what they're implying. When a young girl is alone and defenseless in her backyard, you can sexually assault her as much as you want. And indeed, the statistics bear that out. Somalia ranks as the top country in the world for sexual violence against children, among other abuses. And that's what they're very clearly implying here. Therefore, according to this letter, we should have some sympathy for this poor guy. After all, he's just having trouble getting used to our peculiar little customs in the United States. It's apparently very difficult to adjust to this whole thing where we don't sexually assault children. Just like it's tough to learn, say, the rules of baseball or tipping etiquette when you go out to eat. And it's just like that. And that's the position of this Islamic center in St. Paul. He's adjusting to our culture and having some growing pains when it comes to the whole, not sexually abusing children thing. Never mind the fact that at the time of this attack, Kalinal had lived in the United States for nearly 2 decades, so he had quite a bit of time to get used to our laws and, quote, customs. And more importantly, you're supposed to ignore the fact that regardless of where you were raised, you should know at an instinctual level that it's one of the most profound evils imaginable to assault a child. It doesn't require education to know this. It doesn't require customs. It doesn't require anything but a shred of conscience. It requires having the moral awareness of a human being instead of, say, a lizard. With this letter, the Somali community in Minnesota is acknowledging that, by their own words, they don't have that level of moral awareness, which means quite simply that they don't have any business being in this country. They should be deported, and their temporary protected status, which has gone on for 34 years, should be immediately rescinded. This summer isn't just hot, it is historic. Flash flood warnings are at their highest in 40 years. Storms after storm, towns are inundated, roads wash away. Everywhere you see the same thing. People waiting for water, for food, for someone to come and save them. And you keep hearing help's on the way, but what if it's not? What if help takes days or never comes at all? That could happen. Truth is, the system can barely handle one emergency, let alone dozens at once. Don't wait until disaster strikes. Take steps now to protect yourself and your loved ones. Be prepared, because when every second counts, you need to count on yourself. And especially as a father, it's important to be looking out for your family. I know I take that course, very seriously, as any father does. Right now, My Patriot Supply is giving away 4 weeks of emergency food. Just go to mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh to find out how you can claim your free 4-week food supply and join millions of Americans who are preparing with My Patriot Supply. Claim your free 4-week kit today at mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh. That's mypatriotsupply.com/Walsh. Now, if it's true that abusing children is a part of the culture, then, as they're implying and as the statistics really do bear out, then this culture should not be permitted to enter the U.S. under any circumstance. Now, to be clear, I'm not cherry-picking one letter here. The Al Hissan Islamic Center in St. Paul sent this letter to the judge on behalf of the Somali community, but they weren't the only ones to voice their support for this unapologetic predator. I went looking through the docket on this case, and I found that many of this guy's family and close associates wrote letters to the judge as well. And they all said the same thing. Here's how prosecutors summarized those letters in their sentencing memo to the judge. Quote, "Finally, defendant's family and friends do not acknowledge his actions, the impact they had on the victim, or recognize his wrongdoing. The statements show that either defendant has not told them what he is convicted of, or that they are dismissive of his crime. Family members are focused on the impact that this has had on him and his family. None of them acknowledge the victim and her family. While they cite that he's a person of good character, it is more likely that this offense is a side of him they did not know about, nor do they want to know about. But quite simply, sexual assault on a child is not something a person of good character does." There's the understatement of the century. The victim's mother also stated that she and her family have been receiving death threats within the Somali community because of this case. Yes, members of the Somali community are currently threatening to murder the victim's mother. That's how they're responding to the fact that this woman's daughter was brutally attacked and sexually assaulted by a member of their community. They're responding by threatening to kill the victim's mom. They're continuing to terrorize the family as a community. And by the way, at trial, Colonel made it clear that he blames the victim's mother for what happened. Certainly doesn't blame himself. And that might seem insane to you or to me or to any civilized person, but not to this wonderful community, it would seem. Now, you could tell in that paragraph I just read that the prosecutor is trying to search for some plausible reason why all of the Somalis involved in this case are defending this man. Like, to a man, they are all defending him. And he says that, well, maybe the family didn't know that side of him. This is the kind of line that if you're a prosecutor in Minnesota, you have to include in your argument. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence that Somalis have no business in this country, prosecutors still have to pretend that we're dealing with one or two bad apples who can be reformed. Even when the entire Somali community rushes to defend this scumbag and attacks the victim's family, that's the fiction that apparently needs to be maintained. In the end, the Somalis got what they wanted. And that shouldn't be surprising since they effectively control the government of Minnesota at this point. The judge, Michael Burns, handed out a sentence of just 12 years in this case, with release from prison after 10 years, and the rest served on probation. So he's going to do 10 years in prison for abducting and sexually assaulting a child out of her parents' backyard. 10 years. This is a sentence that, without any doubt whatsoever, should have been life imprisonment at a minimum, assuming the sharks and the firing squad weren't available. But that won't happen because of Minnesota's laws, which are extremely permissive when it comes to child abuse. Kalina will be out on the streets in just a few years. Again, this is nothing new in Minneapolis or the UK, where Somali rape gangs are particularly active. They don't often report on cases like this in the local news, but they're increasingly common. Here's another case from an apartment complex in Minneapolis a few years ago to give you some idea of how these stories are covered if the media touches them at all. Watch this.
We begin this evening with a disturbing story about a 10-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted by a stranger.
Minneapolis police say it happened Sunday evening in the hallway of an apartment building in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. Police arrested 34-year-old Ahmed Hersi Abdi less than 24 hours later. As Angela Davis shows us, court records show he has a history of mental illness.
I don't know, maybe some sick person did this, but I couldn't believe it.
A criminal complaint states that neighbors heard screams on the third-floor hallway. When they found a young girl crying, they ran to get help from 2 off-duty Minneapolis police officers. The victim told police that a man, later identified as Ahmed Abdi, followed her in and out of an elevator, and as she walked down a hallway, he asked for her name. The complaint states he then extended his hand to her. When she shook his hand, he refused to let go.
Now, they don't tell you where Ahmed Hirsi Abdi came from. They don't tell you if he's legally in this country or who allowed him to enter. Instead, they refer to him as a stranger. They tell us he's mentally ill, and then they spend the rest of the segment talking about various resources for sexual assault survivors. But the one resource they don't talk about, even though it would drastically cut down on cases like this, is the resource known as mass deportation. And that's clearly necessary at this point because we're not dealing, again, with one or two bad actors. This is an endemic problem in the culture. 7 years ago, a region in Somalia established a new lab to investigate sexual assaults. And I'm going to play this for you and see if you notice anything in this report.
Somalia has opened its first forensic laboratory to investigate rape cases. The lab, with support from the Swedish government and the UN Population Fund, brings cutting-edge technology to a part of the world still lacking paved roads and reliable electricity.
We used to send DNA from here to Nairobi or from here to South Africa. So those restraints now are easy. We can manage this and get answers within timely period, within hours, within minutes, where we used to have days, sometimes months to receive those.
The lab opened less than a year after the Puntland region passed its first law criminalizing sexual offenses.
There are some police officers who say rape is not a big deal and consider it a minor thing. They say it is nothing new.
Kis Shamis Kabdibail is the only police officer in her unit. She handles all cases involving sexual violence in Puntland. Officer Bail says many of her rape cases are handled by community elders. The perpetrator's family may be ordered to pay the victim's family in camels or goats. And that is just the cases that women report.
So as of 2017, Somalia had just gotten around to criminalizing sexual assault. And then with much fanfare, they open a sexual assault forensic center. And the victims, if they're compensated at all, will be rewarded with camels or goats. That's an actual news report from Somalia. Now, you have to ask this question. Do people in this country realize that Somali culture is this backwards? Was there ever a vote on allowing this into our country? Was there ever any kind of national conversation whatsoever about this? Or did we just decide to grant these foreigners temporary protected status 34 years ago and let them flood into the country by hundreds of thousands with no checks and no conversation whatsoever about it? Put simply, we cannot be surprised when we import massive numbers of people from a third world hellhole and then they go on to commit horrible crimes. This kind of behavior is part of the culture. They have said that themselves, and it always has been. That doesn't mean that every Somali commits these crimes or wants to, but it means that the risk is unacceptably high for people that we are welcoming into our home. And given this very obvious fact, it's time for someone in power to answer this fundamental question. Why would we ever let anyone from a culture like this into our country in any capacity under any circumstance? Here's another way of phrasing the question. How does it benefit the United States of America to allow this culture into our country? Explain to me what the benefit is to this country, ours. And now that we made this mistake and allowed them to live here, when are we going to rectify this situation? For that matter, why are we allowing anyone to live here of any ethnicity or nationality who rejects every foundational principle this country stands for? And it's not just Somalis who openly denounce America's interests, morality, customs. Just the other day, Illinois Congresswoman, is a member of Congress, Delia Ramirez, went to Mexico City to announce, quote, "I'm a proud Guatemalan before I'm an American." Now, this is in Spanish, but we'll play the clip. Here it is.
Diciendo unas palabras en español porque yo soy guatemalteca con mucho orgullo, primero que soy americana.
Delia Ramirez, you should know, is the daughter of illegal aliens from Guatemala. She was reportedly born in Chicago, which supposedly grants her citizenship for some reason. She's a walking example of why this administration should continue the fight to end birthright citizenship. And she's a reminder, as we've discussed, that not everyone in this country is an American, even the ones with legal status. Because you have ones with legal status. I'm a Guatemalan before I'm an American. How much clearer can they possibly be? All cultures are created equal, is what we're told, but it's one of the many great lies of modern times. Many of our problems in the West are born from this lie. A lot of people have pretended otherwise over the years. They've invented various justifications for allowing these people to destroy entire cities in this country. But now that Somalis have finally told the truth about their culture to a judge in Minneapolis, and now that members of Congress are admitting their disloyalty to audiences in Mexico City, there simply isn't anything to debate anymore. All we have to do is read their words, listen to them, pay attention to their actions, and respond accordingly. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.